Hello, this is Josh Donahue for History of Psychology 4472, Article 11. Article 11 was done by W.M. O'Neill and A.A. Laudur, titled The Phi-Phenomenon, Rallying Point or Turning Point. And it details the 1912 work of Max Wertheimer in his paper entitled Experimentellen Studien über Dasein von Bewegung. It's a rallying cry for Gestalt theory. It was describing the Phi-phenomenon, and from it there came 3 or 4 main propositions. So what the Phi-phenomenon is, ultimately it was an experiment done with lines where individuals would look at a screen and one line would appear over here. There would be a lag between the first line disappearing and then a second line appearing over here. And now, when you have a lag of 1 or 2 seconds between the presentation of the first line and the second line, people would just be like, yep, that's a line, I see that, cool. But if the lag time was drastically reduced and they popped up in rapid fire succession, boom, boom, then individuals would say, you know what, I perceived movement between the first line and the second line, much like you might see in a flip book, where the lines are not moving themselves, and yet we perceive movement because of the rapid presentation of the lines. So it would look kind of something like this. This is what was shown, where there's just one single thing going on, and then over time the second presentation of the line would show up. This is what's actually shown, but what's perceived is the continual movement between point A and point B. This movement was not merely the stroboscopic effect that was known as early as 1830, but this pure movement was more focused on the process of why we see this, why these objects were apparently connected even though they weren't moving. There's motion, and yet there's not. Now, this whole thing can kind of rest its laurels, has its foundations based off of some of Wilhelm Wundt's early work. People attribute him as having a lot of influence in the field because he focused on the emergent properties, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The little parts might just be a line here and a line here, but the whole says there's a line here and a line here with movement between. It's actually not just line, it's the same line. That's what we might perceive. And people wondered, is this the mind doing its thing, or is this like the eyes? Are the eyes tricking people or whatever? Or is this some new element entirely? Ultimately, this whole function was attributed and kind of funneled into the holistic approach, the holistic movement of the time. And this was significant because it was the only systematically experimental school in the holistic movement. So the 3 main propositions that came from this experiment that Max Wertheimer put out. The first is that we can perceive things without being an actual stimuli present. There was not the stimuli of movement, and yet we perceived that it was. Our brain filled in the gaps. Our brain can do that. It's pretty awesome. That's the first point. The second point is that this is automatic. Our brains just do this. We don't have to tell it, okay, now I want you to make sense of this. It just does it. It's great. The third point is that this is generated by the mind, and it's not generated by the eyes or something else like that. There's not actual movement. This is just our brains interpreting it in this way. Later, they came up with the 4th main proposition that stood the test of time, and that is that we see the whole before we see the individual little parts. We distinguish little parts upon closer inspection, but ultimately we're inclined to see the movement before we see the little individual parts. And of course, this whole thing kind of goes back into whether you go with the early or the late selection model of cognition, of paying attention. Do I pay attention to everything and then decide what's important, or do I only do it later? Anyway, so this article was very interesting. If you need to know more about Gestalt theory, please look into my next video. I decided to do 2 this week. So thank you very much. Have a great day.